I don't know what's going on. Let me check and make sure, because it worked just a minute ago. Can you hear me now? No? I don't know. It was working, now it's not working. I'm just not going to rely on it. I'm sorry, people. You're not going to be able to hear any of this. So I'm going to stand up and try to talk louder. And so Greek philosophy comes together with divine command, okay? And then what you get is the Middle Ages. And then after the Middle Ages, you get the Protestant Reformation, and that's the first big kink in this single flow of divine command and reason, Greek philosophy. And so by the time you get to the Enlightenment, it starts to break up, as Professor Kreeft says, into the swamp again. You get deontological ethics, you get utilitarian ethics, you get the absence of any absolutes. Everything is about just what works, what floats your boat. Thomas Aquinas would never have said that. And so how do we get there? And that's what this story is all about. But I want to start with two personalities. Do you remember St. Thomas More? So St. Thomas More says you cannot marry your brother, you cannot divorce your wife to marry Anne Boleyn. You're validly married. The Pope says you're validly married. I am the king's good servant. Do you remember that? But God's first. And what happens? He gets his head chopped off. So you go forward about not quite 500 years. Do you remember William Brennan? He was one of the liberals on the Supreme Court, one of the major architects of Roe versus Wade. And so a Sunday mass goer, got the Latari Medal from Notre Dame University. But his was, I'm a Catholic, but when I get and put on that black robe, I just look at the Constitution and the laws of the United States, and that's what I'm charged with enforcing. Does that make sense? So how does that explain Roe versus Wade? And so something else has happened, and it's about the meaning of conscience. So I'm going to run through the history of morality and ethics in a way that I'm hoping it'll be easily understood. Can everybody hear me okay? There's plenty of room up front. Okay, so here's the great question. I think you already know the answer. Is conscience formed by truth, or does conscience decide truth? Do you get the difference between those two things? And so let's go back to the beginning of what is this really amazing period in history, that 4th century BC, the time of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And it's this transition from a mythic world into a rational world, and how the Greeks bring rationality to a world where everything was simply wise stories. And that's why in like the Old Testament, it's a mix of things. There's divine law, but there's also myths, you know it, because they're shared amongst cultures. They're ways of understanding. How the Jews tell the story is unique to Israel. They don't tell it like the pagans do. But Socrates is one of the most consequential people in history because he had a Socratic approach. How do you think you know anything? What does it mean to know? And so his big area of concern was, how do you know when something's good? Because, and Aristotle had developed this, is something good in itself, or is it only apparently good? It's the difference between saying something is actually good and something's good for me. Or as people we all know would say, there's truth and then there's my personal truth. This isn't anything new. This was the argument between Socrates and the sophists. The sophists were basically mouthpieces for hire. Their job was to help you win whatever the argument was. They can make the best argument. That's why I tell people you have to tell the difference between an argument and a fact. They're not the same kind of thing. So here's a handy thing you could take away from tonight. There are only 3 kinds of conversations you can have. If you can identify another one, I'd love to hear it. The first is empirical. That is, what's reality? What's gravity? What's that? What's that? What's that? That's an empirical inquiry, the way reality is, and especially material reality. Here's the second argument you can have. It's a philosophical argument. Even in science, when, I was going to say Adolf Hitler, but that's not it. Einstein, when he says E equals mc squared. No, that's not a fact, that's an interpretation. That, in the time before Einstein, would have been called natural philosophy. How is it that you understand the nature of reality? And so some interpretations are better than other interpretations, but they're human ways of understanding, well, how the speed of light, how light reaches us at different times, because it comes from stars that are at unequal distance from where we perceive, right? And so understanding that's interpretations are really that to the point, that true. Here's the third argument that you can have, and it's called moral, which is just the word ought. So you know what material reality is? You come up with an understanding of material reality or your spiritual reality. What ought you to do about it? That's what a moral argument is, right? Morality is always about the duties that are imposed by how you understand and what reality is. Fair enough? So think about it. If you can come up with another kind of argument that you've invented, I think the world would love to hear it. But otherwise, if you think about almost any argument, you ask yourself, is this some fact about reality? Is this an interpretation? Or is this a moral statement? Because they're all related to each other. Okay, so if you look at Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, what they're most famous for is the roots of what we call virtue morality. The word vir is a Latin word which means man, so virtue reality is manliness. And for the Greeks who did not have the Judeo-Christian religion, at best they were polytheists, they had multiple gods, right? Their sense of what the great goods were are different from Christian goods. And so when you look into the ancient world, into the pagan world, it's not a Christian world. Here's a really good example. Pride. Pride is one of the 7 deadly sins, right? If you're proud, you're underwater. But pride, for the Greeks and the Romans, was a great civic virtue. Dignitas, gravitas. Other people saw you and wanted to be you. And so when Aristotle was thinking about virtue, he was asking, what's it mean to live a good life? What are the things that you want to have? And he came up with 3 answers that all competed. The first was honor, dignitas, that you're a big guy in your community, that you die a big guy in your community. And so for Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, they all know a guy named Alcibiades, character in Platonic, the Symposium, one of Plato's dialogues. And Alcibiades is handsome. Everybody wants to be him. He's a great warrior. When he stands up and speaks, everybody listens. By the end of his career, he's a traitor. He goes to the enemy, the Persians, where he's hidden. He comes back, and he's chased out of town again. And so honor can come and go, right? That's the problem of honor as the greatest good. Is it really? Which is having a few drinks too many. You know, hanging out with numerous beautiful women or men, however you swing, right? That the idea is that this brings me physical pleasure. So for the strain of Greek thought, and if you ever hear of the Epicureans, which kind of made a comeback recently, the idea of it's not hedonistic, but you want to live a life that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain. It doesn't see any great role for suffering in life. And so when you hear arguments in our current moral world about euthanasia, right, is why should these people suffer? When you've heard arguments in the past of why abortion is actually a moral good is there are certain lives that are not worth living, right? Isn't it sad that Americans borrowed an argument that Nazi Germans had made, Adolf Hitler had made? But this is the problem when there isn't a sense of absolutes. And that's really the problem of Greek philosophy. So when Aristotle finally settles on what he thinks is the greatest good, this is not Christianity, but what he thinks is the greatest good, is he'll say contemplation, wisdom. And so you sit there and you think thoughts that are deep thoughts that no one can take away from you. It's the one thing that you can always have. And so, for instance, you can make the argument that Jesus Christ crucified is a happy man by Aristotelian measures because he does precisely what he thinks the wisest thing to do is. He gives himself to God. And it goes where it goes. It's why Socrates in the Apology, if you remember, Socrates is accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and so he's forced to commit suicide. And the Apology is he and his friends as he talks about what might come next. Because Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all believed that there was something that followed this life. It's really interesting. It's just different things. Plato in his Republic wrote about the afterlife, and it sounds exactly like reincarnation as Hinduism would talk about it, because there is clearly some kind of influence between India and Greece. Because if you remember this, Aristotle was Alexander the Great's teacher, and he went all the way to India. And so it could be that that would be a way that ideas from the Indian subcontinent would make all the way to Greece, and why they would talk about reincarnation, because it's not really a big part of any other Mediterranean thought. So I just point that out because this is reason alone. If it was you didn't believe in God, you never heard of God, no one had ever explained to you the Christian gospel, what sense would you make of the world? Because it's pretty clear that Thomas Aquinas relies greatly on Aristotle. But when it comes to that highest good of contemplation, do you have one guess who Thomas Aquinas puts there? The highest good? God. Whatever the highest good is, that's what you call God. And it's beyond anything in this world, because there is no good that you can attain in this life that will completely satisfy you. So one of his arguments for the existence of God is called the argument by desire, is that if you have desire, one of the reasons to say that materialism is an inadequate way of looking at reality. How am I doing so far? All right. Good enough. I would settle for good enough. So what we'll do now is remember I talked about the swamp? So the swamp is the sophists and the Epicureans. What's the greatest good? Is it honor and dignitas? Is it pleasure? Or is it contemplation? And then the other part of that great stream is the Jewish religion. Divine command, right? And I think we're pretty familiar with what divine command is. And for us, divine command is the Sermon on the Mount, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's Jesus's law. And it's expressed in a different way than the Decalogue is. Remember, it was this Sunday, if you can remember back to this Sunday, to tablets. One is the first commandments about God, 1 through 3, or if you're Orthodox or Reformed, 1 through 4, however you count them, but it's all really the same material. And then the second tablet is honor your father and your mother, to don't covet your neighbor's goods, and everything in between about murder, adultery, and all of these things. So, divine command, you love God above all things, and in order to do that, you have to create some boundaries in life. And so you have rules. Call them absolutes. Things that you just don't do. That is the biggest thing Judeo-Christianity brings. And well, maybe that's not true, but I'm going to say it anyway. But one of the biggest things that Judeo-Christianity brings in the moral discourse, that there are certain things that if you do it, you destroy your own humanity. Because at the heart of either divine command or virtue philosophy or divine command religion or theology is, what's the goal of moral living? The goal of moral living is, what kind of person do you become? That's the first thing, is can you be a good person and do evil things? And the Christian answer is, of course not. Of course not. So what happens with this swamp into this mighty stream? And that takes us into the Middle Ages. And the beginning of the Middle Ages is St. Augustine. St. Thomas Aquinas, maybe the high point of the Middle Ages, not simply because of him, but St. Francis of Assisi and him were almost contemporaries. And the Middle Ages kind of come to an end by 1521, which is still the people in the 16th century, Shakespeare. They'd have been comfortable with a medieval world because they still saw this unity between all knowledge unified in God. And so the empirical, God created the empirical, the philosophical, our reason serving faith, and then the moral is us serving God. And so the understanding of God is what ties together all of these strands that I've discussed about virtue and divine command. And so the world has this coherence to it. It's expressed architecturally in the great cathedrals. There's this great coherence in how they're built. But where do they get some of those golden ratios? From the Greeks. The Greeks had a huge impact on the Middle Ages to this very day. You know, if you like art, it's knowing when to break the rules to get the effect you want. Well, the rules are always these Greek rules about proportion and elegance. The echoes of the past are always with us. I was talking to a young woman. She was from one of these Christian churches, and I was talking about the history of Christianity. How do we get to this present day? And all these different kinds of arguments that evangelicals will bring up. And then she finally said, I really don't care about history. I don't care about any of it. And I said, well, then, you know, if you can't trust the experience of others, good and bad, then you just have what you have today. And that was essentially it. And I thought, wow, I'd never actually met anyone who had ever said that. I met lots of people who wish they understood history better. I met lots of people who think they wish they understood where ideas came from better. That what we believe is not the same thing as what Aristotle believed, but we still receive the fruits of Aristotle's thought, right, in virtue. And so let's talk about virtue a little bit before we talk about Thomas Aquinas. So what's virtue? Well, it's going after the greatest good. What's the greatest good for Aristotle? The greatest good for Aristotle is contemplation of the good. And you see that in Plato too. The difference, you hear Plato and Aristotle. The difference between Plato and Aristotle is Plato saw the material world as being one thing and the world of thought as being something else. It's called dualism. Have you ever heard that term before? Dualism, when we think of spirit and matter, that's a dualistic way of thinking. Now, it doesn't mean that you're a dualist if you talk about having a soul and a spirit and a body, because Aristotle took his idea, what Plato, we translate it as forms, but the word that Plato uses that gives form to reality is eidos. It's where we get the word idea, okay? So that matter is whatever it is, but it's this form, this spiritual reality that exists in the divine world that gives us the form of human beings. Does that make sense? That's what dualism is. And you know where you still see it, because these ideas never ever go away. Do you ever remember reading about the spiritualists of the 19th century, seances, stuff like that? Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was really big on it. I think he'd been raised Catholic, but he wandered away and became a spiritualist. So they used to fake these pictures of the spirit leaving the body. They would pay for a picture. Do you remember any of this? And so one of the pictures they did was cheesecloth coming out of this woman's mouth, and they lit it to look like it was this, you know, your idea of what a ghost looks like coming out. And so that the idea of ghosts, for instance, which we talked about in the first session that we had, you know, the idea of a spirit disconnected from the body. Now, what I always say about ghosts is I have no idea what a ghost is. I don't think anyone could say what a ghost is. That people have experience of ghosts, obviously, even to the present age, in other cultures. It's not a Christian idea, it's pan-human. Well, so Aristotle, the idea of the good, the greatest good, and how do you achieve the greatest good? Through a life of virtue. And what's virtue? Well, virtue first is trying to understand what the good is. So Plato in the Republic, which is one of the most famous books ever written, is all about Socrates asking questions about what the good is. And some people think it's a book about politics, but it's not really a book about politics. It's a book about the human soul. And so the way he talks about the soul is he compares the soul to a city. What's a well-run city? And he says, well, it has to have guardians, it has to have justice, it has to have education. And so what does a well-run body look like? Well, you have to be strong enough to defend yourself, you have to know what the good is, and you have to be able to provide for yourself. And so the comparison goes on because his idea is if you could all agree on what a well-run city looked like, that would be the image of the human person. Does that seem logical? There is a connection between the individual and community. And when individuals corrupt, you're not going to have a just society. So when you complain about America, and somehow America is a reflection of Americans, this is the reality of the relationship between the individual and the community. So how do you know what a virtue is? And so here's how Aristotle would talk about virtue. He would say it was the mean between two extremes. You know what a mean is, right? The middle. And so cowardice is an extreme. Foolhardiness is an extreme. Courage is the virtue between the two. You don't run away from a fight, but you don't throw your life away either. Does that make sense? And so courage is whatever that is. And the virtuous man, according to Aristotle, is just the person, because this is all about males, is just the person who knows the right thing to do, the right thing to say, in the right context. Just always knowing what the right thing to do is. And how do you get that according to Aristotle? Practice, practice, practice. Building of habit. By the time you get to Aquinas, he really brings a lot of that into, I think it's the Summa Contra Gentiles, but I'm probably wrong on that. Because he wrote several things. But he just takes that idea and he baptizes it. Because it's a very rational idea about how you can develop habits and understanding what the problem of sin is. And so this is Peter Kreeft again, because I just think the way he explains things is so easy to understand. When you look at Aquinas and virtue, he looks at it as God's story. So think about it in terms of a story. First, there's the plot. And so for Aquinas, the plot is what happens to nations, the fate of peoples. It's the social history. Then in a story, there's always character, right? And so for the character, it's individual ethics and how they fit in with the large story. And so then with any story that's worth a story, there's always a theme, right? And so the theme for St. Thomas Aquinas is the summum bonum, the greatest good. And he goes through what the possible greatest goods are. And I'll just run through a list of them as soon as I get down here and put my glasses on. So here are the greatest goods. He says wealth is a great good. Well, I mean, does anybody here really want to be poor? I mean, I don't mean poor in spirit. I mean, just, you're leaving here and you don't know what you're going to do. That kind of poor. No, you want enough wealth to take care of what your needs are. But the problem of wealth is if you rely on it, it becomes your basis for existence. He said you can't really have happiness with that because it can be taken away from you, embezzled or anything else. Honor, same thing. Does this sound like Aristotle? Honor, that, you can lose honor. Fame, not all it's cracked up to be because you can become infamous also. Power, the problem with power is you're always worried about losing it. Somebody else is going to knock you off. So when you see pictures of Vladimir Putin, does he seem to be a happy guy to you? Health? Well, you're going to lose health. So it's not the greatest good, although it is a great good. Pleasure, as long in moderation, it's a great good, but there's a certain point when pleasure's behind you. He was a part of it. He was like Mr. Bilby, founded the firm. Mr. Bilby, when he went to law school at the University of Arizona, right about the time of the First World War, he brought his horse down from Safford so he'd have a way to get around town. And he worked until he was mid-90s. And Hal Warnock, who was one of his friends and one of the partners, Mr. Warnock was always very good to me. Really a good lawyer. But he said that when Ralph Bilby was dying, he snuck in a bottle of scotch because he was a Mormon, a Jack Mormon. But he thought he wanted to have one last drink with Ralph before he passed. And Ralph looked at Hal, and Hal told me this story. He said, Hal, honestly, I just lost my taste for it. Well, that's it. Every pleasure, whatever it is, right? At some point, it just isn't going to be there anymore. So, those guys were great guys. Virtue, well, virtue is where as far as Aristotle can take you. Now, to say that virtue can make you happy, well, making good and prudent decisions, because these are the virtues: justice, right relationship with others; prudence, good decision making; temperance is moderation in your appetites; courage is fundamentally about endurance, getting up and fighting the good fight, being yourself in good times and bad, sickness and in health. It takes courage to be married, right? Be a parish priest, because you live these little quiet little lives. And mostly what you do, nobody ever sees. Most of the sacrifices you make, you're the one that knows it. And so virtue is a beautiful thing, but not the greatest good. Aquinas says the greatest good is something that we can only desire in this world, possess in some sense, but in the world to come. And so what does Aquinas do to Aristotelian philosophy? What Aquinas does is he says the greatest good is God and union with God. And so he baptizes Aristotle. It has had a profound influence on our own morality. Hey, I think I'm doing okay. I might actually pull this together. And so are you with me so far? Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, divine virtue, divine command, Judeo-Christianity, Aquinas and Augustine, bring them together and marry them together. And we think of that as Catholic moral theology to this very day. I mean, it's why Catholics think about morality differently. Now, you recognize you may do bad things, right? But you know some absolutes that you absolutely should not do. Anyone disagree? Have the courage to disagree? Because there are just some things that are absolutely wrong. It doesn't mean that Catholics don't do them, but we have this faith, and it is faith at that point, about what forgiveness is. because actually Monsignor McCarthy's writing this book. He says what happens after Aquinas in Catholic theology in the wake of the Reformation is the disconnection between moral theology and spirituality. And so living a moral life becomes the state of grace, which allows you to come to communion. But if you do X, Y, and Z, you're no longer in the state of grace. This is a caricature of Catholic moral theology. Because the whole point of Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, St. Francis de Sales, is how the spiritual life is how you discipline yourself to bring your life in line with virtuous living. It takes discipline and choices till the day you die. But that's prayer, it's fasting, it's almsgiving, it's learning to love God, and then make good choices. Because we are fallen people. Even we say that baptism forgives original sin, which is disconnection from God. But I always point people who come to the confessional and they're just so overwhelmed with all the stuff they can see in their life. I say, that's a really good sign. Because if you really were as awful a sinner as you think you are, then you wouldn't see anything wrong with what you do. That's what mortal sin is. You can't see yourself in the mirror anymore. And so I said, and I think this is very solid. I'd say seeing your failures as a human being is always the commonality of all the saints. They are not blowing smoke when they see themselves as the worst, because they see themselves somehow in the light of God. I say it's like driving east on the highway headed for Gila Bend, if you've ever been there. And it's dark outside, and you hear all these plop, 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 but everything's okay because you can see the road. Then the sun starts to come up over beautiful Gila Bend, and what do you see? You see all these bugs on the windshield. Well, that's the Holy Spirit in human sin. But that is what it is. And so that's that great marriage I'm talking about spirituality and the moral life. And if you see it like that, that's a very hopeful way of seeing it. Then you have to do something about it, right? Empirical reality, philosophical understanding leads to moral action. Okay, so what happens after Aquinas? So Aquinas dies in like the early 14th century. I think I'm right about it. Maybe it's the late 13th century. But he dies about 200 years before Niccolo Machiavelli. And you've heard of Niccolo Machiavelli? Okay. Machiavelli wrote a book called The Prince, and it became one of the most consequential books in Western philosophy because he is the first person to give a philosophical defense of what virtue theory in Christianity would teach as sin. Why is it okay for a prince to do bad things? Cesare Borgia, who's the son of Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, Lucretia Borgia, you know all these names? Okay, so Cesare, his dad, the Pope, and he's an illegitimate son he had with a prostitute, who he really liked until he kind of kicked her out of the papal court. Well, this is human sexuality, right? And so Cesare was given a French army to command to bring the middle papal states, Romana, it's called the middle part of Italy, to keep it under control. So he uses the French soldiers to do that. But that's expensive, hiring French mercenaries and Swiss mercenaries. So he knows he has to raise his own army. While he's doing that, he puts a man over those living in the Romana, this middle part of Italy. Can't remember the guy's name, but he is ruthless, cruel. He and his henchmen would just show up at your house, drag you out, and kill you, and leave you in the public square. And so people got so upset, they went and talked to Cesare Borgia, who had sent him there, who was shocked, I tell you, that he was doing bad things. So one day, Cesare Borgia's confederate ends up in the plaza on a piece of wood cut in two. And Cesare is treated as the hero of the Romagna because he killed the great satanic police chief in Romagna. What do you think of that behavior? Joe Biden cuts Kamala Harris in two and blames everything on her. But Niccolo Machiavelli says, this is the wise prince. Better to be feared than loved. Do you remember that? That's Machiavelli. Because for him, he's a materialist. There is no real such thing as the good. You can't prove it. And this is the beginning of the Enlightenment, right? Because in the Enlightenment, materialism, this is when people say there's a fight between faith and science, that the idea would be that, boy, if you can't measure it or weigh it, it doesn't exist. You've heard this? Okay. So how much do your thoughts weigh? Well, that's the problem with it, isn't it? And so, actually, there's a really interesting book everyone wants to know about. James Madden, Mind, Body, and Spirit. There's 5 different theories of why human beings have consciousness and why we can think. Don't you think someone should have figured it out by now? Shouldn't it be the most obvious thing? And why is it that they argue about it? Because how can you possibly resolve it? I mean, if you're Plato, it's because there's a ghost in the machine. Aristotle, which is the Catholic position, is called hylomorphism. Have you ever heard that? It's what I talked about in the very first meeting. Spirit, soul, body. We share something with God. We share something with the animal world, materiality. And the form is God's idea of John Arnold. And it's the form that's always preserved in God. Does that make sense? That's called hylomorphism. There's more than one aspect to every form that we see. But there's other ways of looking at it, and you can explore that book for yourself. But with Machiavelli, he just became a rationale for what leaders and people in power had been doing forever, right? I mean, but the idea of that is this. Why do you think in America there's so little respect for institutions? Any ideas? How about starting to lie? You don't think anyone in the government ever lies to you? You don't think the press lies to you? The church has hid facts, right? Basic morality. Tell the truth. Because if you don't tell the truth, then people don't trust you, right? And so remember what Aquinas had said. There's this big story. Then there's my participation in the big story, my ethics. And then there's the greatest good, the summum bonum. And so because we started out with Thomas More and William Brennan, remember? How do you get from Thomas More to William Brennan? When can you separate your personal, moral life, which makes you a good person, from doing bad things in public life? Because by doing bad things, you serve the greater good. I mean, when they argue about Nagasaki and Hiroshima, who makes a virtue argument about that? This is where that comes from. So Machiavelli is really, he dies like just a couple of years before Martin Luther posts his 99 Thesis, which is supposedly, some people say it happened, some people said that's just a story. I don't know, I wasn't there. But that the idea is that he had complaints. And so what happens? Well, we kind of went through this, right? Marriage isn't a sacrament anymore. Now it's just a contract. And so you get marriage in America because it's disconnected from God and disconnected from nature. In the difference between the decisions you make as an individual and the decisions that society makes. And so in the wake of Niccolo Machiavelli came the Enlightenment. And the idea of the Enlightenment was reason. René Descartes, cogito ergo sum, if you remember this, he was this famous French scientist, a brilliant guy. But his idea was, how can I have absolute knowledge about anything? And so he goes, so I could just be lied to. Satan could be lying to me. Here's the only reason I can know anything. I think, therefore I am. And so that the core of human existence wasn't that I have a body, it's that I think. Does that make sense? How do you think you get to, I think I'm a male in a female body, or vice versa? That your thoughts could be contrary to the entirety of your person. Because our interior lives are very powerful. They really are. They run so much of our lives. It's just not all that we are. And so, in the Enlightenment, science starts to destroy a notion of God as creator. The idea that God creates individual things. God creates a raccoon, God creates a squirrel, he creates an orchid, a great white shark, which was a cool film on the BBC. You never think of orcas of eating great white sharks, but apparently they taste really good. That's it. So, what happens when faith is challenged? And that's been the story since the Reformation. Because the Reformation destroyed authority. So that's why I think the first time we got together, I said, where does the church come from? The church comes from the Eucharist. Because Christ gave it to the disciples, and they gathered to celebrate the Eucharist. And that's the church. And then they wrote the scriptures. So the church doesn't come from the scriptures. I mean, it's the product of the church. It's putting the chicken before the egg, or the egg before the chicken. It's just, they're all together as one reality. But the Eucharist is primary. It's why the Eucharist is such a special place in our communion. So, how do you come to morality when you don't believe in God anymore? Because remember, the medieval synthesis is divine command and Greek philosophy. You with me? And so, without going into all the permutations, two big solutions. The first is Immanuel Kant, K-A-N-T. And he lived in what we think of as the Baltic states. He's a German. And he was a believer, but he was trying to make a case for a common moral philosophy. You know, the difference between philosophy and theology is philosophy is Aristotle, Plato. You don't need God, you just need human reason. Theology is divine command and philosophy together. It's a Christian thing, or it's a Jewish thing. God and reason, that's what theology is. And so he wants to find a place for a common moral theology for all of Europeans, because our problem is we don't have one. When you decide that God isn't part of the picture anymore, what's the basis for your philosophy? And so Kant comes up with something called deontological ethics. Ontos is being, so deontological is something, thank you, not rooted in being. And so he has what he calls the categorical imperative, and that's this. What can you as a person will that other people believe is morally true everywhere and every place? And if you can do that, then that becomes a moral law that is incumbent on every single human being. Does that make sense? And so, like, think of the Decalogue. Could you imagine a culture where I can kill you and you can kill me? That would be a pretty awful culture. The Spartans actually were like that. But they wouldn't kill each other, they'd kill the helots. So there are cultures based on murder, but not murder of your brothers and sisters. And so his point was, you can come to reason that there are just some things you just don't do. That's deontological ethics. And so it's a philosophy that's rule-based. And so whenever you hear, or you're catechized as a Catholic, and moral theology is just a series of rules, do this, don't do that, that's a way of expressing it like Kant would express. Now it's true in virtue, there are rules, right? But remember, in virtue, it's about the mean between two extremes. It's about what kind of person you'll be. Just a couple of minutes. Thank you very much, Court. Here's the second thing, and it's called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So the idea of morality is to do good, right? Now, where do you hear that? Well, how many soldiers, sailors, and Marines did you save when you dropped those bombs in Nagasaki? Isn't it better that this child should die so I can go forward and have the life I'm supposed to have? That's utilitarian reasoning, right? And what justifies it is the good that I achieve. But the problem of utilitarian reasoning is that there is no absolutes. So how do we end up where we are today? Where we are today is just a swamp of different moral reasonings. That's why there's so much moral confusion. It's why we can't have basic conversations because we just don't have the same starting point. I was telling one person, is your starting point about what makes me free, or is my starting point as human existence is the basic truth? Because if it's what makes me free, well then abortion makes me free from obligation. Fair enough? But if existence is the key, then no, there are prior obligations you have to another human being has the right to existence. Does it sound like the abortion debate? Because it is. So I'm going to pull it together with a story my brother told, because I think it's apropos of this whole thing. My brother Kevin gives me a call. He was a political science major in undergrad, and he just talks and talks and talks and talks and talks about politics. And it's like just letting the storm roll through, because he's a real smart guy. And you listen to him. Do not argue. Just listen. And actually, you'll learn something. So he tells me he's watching this TV show about politics. And there's 3 panelists. And the one panelist says, you know, there's a difference between Christianity and Christian nationalism. Have you heard this? Okay. And so what's the difference? The difference is a Christian nationalist believes that their rights come from God. And Christians, they don't believe that. They understand it comes from the state. Hold on. You know what my brother Kevin said? Because he's a lawyer too. So it's interesting. I was just thinking that these truths are self-evident, that our Creator made all men equal, and He endowed them with certain unalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I wonder if anybody else has ever thought that. I mean, when you have a political conversation in our country that doesn't even pay attention to the moral legitimacy of the American state, because that's what the Declaration of Independence is. Why is there any moral legitimacy to this country? Because we rebelled against a lawful king. And that was their reasoning for it. Because everything, people want to believe that they do the good, and they rely on the good. And this is why morality is important, and why I think Christians have something very important to bring to the moral stage. If we'll remember that virtue and divine command is at the root of our theology of morality. And morality is how you ought to live in a world where you have responsibilities to the Creator and to one another. So, I'm only a few minutes over, which is so much better than I did the last 2 weeks. Are there any questions? That is Kant. No, you're right, that's Kant. Well, it is do unto others. And it's that these can always overlap with Christian thinking, but the problem is there's no absolutes. And so that's this divine command part that's hard to say. There's just certain things you cannot do. Yes, sir. Oh, here is the thing. Kant would say you can never use another human being as a means because they're subjects. They're always ends. They're persons. And you owe things to persons. You can't treat them as objects. Fair enough? So that would be Immanuel Kant. And my point is a Catholic could say that, right? But the problem of deontological ethics, reducing anything to rules, what human beings can agree on, is that there are no moral absolutes. Because you could agree, everyone could agree that you should kill your enemies. I mean, you may not want everyone to think you as an enemy, but if it's up to humans to reason to their own moral philosophy, you can justify pretty much anything. You don't agree? Okay. I don't know how to argue with that, you know? You mean Francis? You're right. I don't think he said thing. Well, that was because there was like 20 generations ago a connection to an aborted fetus. That was the point. And so the question is remoteness. I mean, can you do anything that's absolutely pure ever? And the answer to that is you can always go back and find some connection to evil. And so at what point is it so remote that it doesn't have a moral obligation attached to it anymore? And I think that's what he was saying. Well, you know, it's the problem. Remember the way I described it? There's the big story, there's the character, there's the plot. How hard is it that you would never do anything that was evil? I mean, when child labor makes Nike shoes, I mean, just the idea that somehow everything that you do is not a whiff of immorality. We live in a fallen world. I think that what you can do is will that I won't do anything that I'm aware of. But, you know, this is why we talk about grace and the idea of it's not really about our moral purity, because without God's grace, that's impossible for human beings. That's what I was saying about the saints, where they think they're the biggest sinners. I mean, oil pollutes. The Americans, in the wake of the last of the impact of Protestant Christianity, the papers are just full of sin. I mean, things that are bad that you can't really do anything about. How much has guilt been armed and weaponized in America? And so at some point you just have to say, you know, you can only do what you can do. So there were some other questions. I think someone had a question that someone they loved thought that being homosexual was a sin. Have you heard this? So you just have to read the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Lust is a sin. Same-sex acts are a sin. But being heterosexual, asexual, or homosexual, or anything in between, this is not what sin is. Everybody can sin, and it's really the same sin. So, but creating homosexuals as a separate class that are like the new lepers, this is not in the Catechism. In fact, as to all the sins in the section of the Catechism that deals with sexual sins against marriage and chastity, the only part where the Catechism from St. John Paul says that homosexual people should not be subjected to undue discrimination. And so it doesn't say that about masturbators, fornicators, or adulterizers. just about same-sex, because it's this little minority of people, and it's like inexplicable to people that aren't kind of oriented that way. So, was there another question? Oh, that, I got your email. We do 40 hours, and I think our experience of trying to put together 40 hours of worship says perpetual adoration may be more than we can do. Because we're always scrambling at the end. Because doing that part that's at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, those are the tough hours to find people. Anything? Oh, so that's about Eucharistic adoration, perpetual adoration. Is there any other questions? Court. Would you say that again? Are you talking about Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac, the Akedah? Okay. Oh, I think that you have to be able to look at the story of the Old Testament and take it at face value. How does God take savage people, and because our history is savage, we're violent, we want to dominate each other. Why do we have sexual morality? Because we want to dominate each other. Why is consent inadequate as a basis for morality? Because can you consent to having bad things done to you? Because you hope it'll come a relationship out of it? The answer is no, right? So it's how does the big story, how does human beings come into relationship with God? How do I come into relationship with God? And what's the greatest good? Those are the three aspects of any story: the theme, the character, and the plot. And so it's the place where it really comes up is Harem, where Saul loses his kingship because he refused to kill Agag and all the Amalekites and all their cows and dogs and cats and goldfishes. He was supposed to slaughter them all, remember? But he displeased God because he didn't put them all to the sword. And so how do you explain that? This is God's word in human language. How do human beings understand God? Do the Jews always get it right? And the answer is clearly not. And so if you look at early Christian preaching, which is interesting, early Christian preaching is, and you hear it in the New Testament, the part of the Old Testament that actually is from God and the part of the Old Testament that Moses gave to the people. Do you remember when they asked Jesus, is it lawful to divorce your wife? Do you remember this? How come nobody ever asks if it's lawful to divorce your husband? It's just not asked. Well, the thing is, in Exodus, you can't divorce your wife. By the time you get to Deuteronomy, you can. And so that's why Jesus said, because your hardness of heart, Moses told you could do that. And so what can you do to get people to follow? So you always get the sense in the Old Testament, one way of understanding it is God is always tolerating. And then at the end, human beings' sins just destroy themselves. Are we going to destroy ourselves? I mean, Iran gets the bomb. Vladimir Putin in the first year of the war, I'll go nuclear. Holy moly. There are just people in our time and the place who do not think like we do. And as of yet, who are the only people who have ever used an atomic weapon? Us. So I would say about the whole thing, what morality is, this, I love St. Augustine. He says, this will never be the kingdom of heaven. He says that a Catholic's obligation is to try to keep the world from getting as bad as it can get. Now, I would say that guy, that's realistic politics. And so that the idea of progress is going to solve every human problem, this is not Augustinian. Why do liberals hate Augustine? Because he thinks like that. Because the idea of human perfection. My song, which I hate, I tell them I hate it, they sing it anyway, because I'm not as tyrant enough in my own parish. But you remember the song? We're building the city of God. Do you remember that song? Why is it called the city of God? Because God builds it. Are we building the city of God? Are we even capable of it? Holy moly. What an awful hymn. I say it's just heresy. But I am an Augustinian. No, they have done it. That's okay. I didn't grab my torch, but now that I have people behind me and we storm up there. Were there any other questions? Because we are happily at 1 hour. Thank you, Court, for being the conscience of the community. Okay, so let's close with a prayer. I told you my story, though, about we hold these truths to be self-evident. I thought that was so darn funny. So, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Is Mr. and Mrs. Gildea here? Gildea? Oh. How's it pronounced? Gildea. That's a much better way to say it. It's a much better way to say it. Mary, did you ever watch her on TV? She's so British, but she's just kind of eccentric. Oh, I'd rather Romans, you get it in something hard, which is awful, it's awful. And that's why the best book in the Romans is the God is the gospel. Give yourself about a year to read it. Because it's a lie, but he lives in the culture, and he's very Christian, and he just takes it apart. Or Hammer and Thompson. About the Amalekites? He's negotiating.
Oh, yeah. He did negotiate.
Abraham, I forget how many concubines he had. After Sarai dies, he takes his wife and his children by then. That's in chapter 23 or 24. Yeah.
You have all the other things coming through.
No idea.
I hope there aren't others who are avoiding these.
Could be. We'll find out.
I have to be in that day. We stood around.
So if you have pool with water, which you would see when I got here, pretty soon it's gonna be a little kid face down here. And I'm gonna wait for it. He was a